The scream inside the ballroom was not loud, but it was sharp enough to stop every conversation at once. Duchess Margaret Whitmore stood near the marble staircase, her hand pressed against her chest, staring at her son as though he had struck her. Around her, dozens of guests turned their heads. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. The orchestra, sensing something had gone wrong, let the music fade into silence. "Say that again, Alexander," Margaret whispered. "Say it again, because I refuse to believe I heard you correctly." Duke Alexander Whitmore did not flinch. He stood tall in his dark evening coat, his jaw set, his eyes calm in a way that unsettled his mother more than anger would have. "I said I am going to marry Alina Hartley," he repeated, his voice steady enough for the entire room to hear. "I have already asked her. She has already said yes." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Somewhere near the punch table, a woman gasped. A man chuckled under his breath and quickly covered his mouth when Margaret's sharp gaze swept toward him. Alina Hartley. The name meant nothing to most of the guests, and that was precisely the problem. She was not the daughter of a baron. She was not the niece of a wealthy merchant. She had no family crest, no inheritance, no name that opened doors. Alina had grown up in St. Agnes' Home for orphan children, a modest gray building on the edge of town, where forgotten children were raised on porridge and prayers. Margaret's fingers curled into the fabric of her gown. "An orphan," she said, as though tasting something bitter. "You wish to marry an orphan." "I wish to marry the woman I love," Alexander corrected gently. "Her past does not frighten me, mother. I do not understand why it frightens you." Laughter broke out near the far wall, thin and cruel. It came from his cousin Victoria, who covered her mouth with a gloved hand but did nothing to hide the amusement dancing in her eyes. Beside her stood her brother Nathaniel, smirking into his wine glass. "Forgive me," Victoria said, stepping forward with practiced grace, though her words carried anything but kindness. "But surely you understand how this looks, cousin. The Duke of Whitmore, heir to one of the oldest titles in the country, marrying a girl who scrubbed floors for her supper." "She did not scrub floors," Alexander said quietly. "She taught children how to read. She nursed the sick when the home could not afford a doctor. She gave away meals she needed herself so younger children would not go hungry." "How noble," Nathaniel said, his tone dripping with mockery. "A saint, then." "Tell me, dear cousin, does sainthood come with a dowry these days, or are we simply meant to be charmed by her good heart?" A few nearby guests laughed softly, careful not to laugh too loudly in front of the Duke himself, but loud enough that their amusement could not be mistaken. Alexander's uncle, Charles Whitmore, a heavy-set man with a face permanently arranged into disapproval, stepped closer. He had managed the family's financial affairs for years and viewed every decision through the lens of profit and reputation. "Alexander," Charles said, lowering his voice as though that might make his words less humiliating, "this family has built its name over 3 centuries. Bloodlines, alliances, every marriage in this family has strengthened our position. What does this girl bring us?" "Nothing, no land, no connections, no standing." "She brings honesty," Alexander said. "She brings kindness that was never taught to her, only lived. I have watched men and women in this very room smile at me while plotting how to use my title for their own gain. Alina has never once asked me for anything." Silence spread through the group like frost across glass. For a moment, no one spoke, and Alexander wondered if perhaps his words had reached someone. But then Margaret laughed, a short, brittle sound with no warmth in it at all. "You are a romantic fool," she said. "You believe you are rescuing her from a life of hardship, and in your mind that makes you noble. But marriages are not rescues, Alexander. They are foundations. What foundation can a girl with no name provide for the next Duke of Whitmore?" "A strong one," Alexander answered without hesitation. "Because she has survived more in 19 years than most people in this room will survive in a lifetime, and she has done it without losing her goodness. That is not weakness, mother. That is strength most of us will never understand." Victoria rolled her eyes, though she tried to disguise it as boredom. "How touching, truly. but strength does not seat well at a dinner table with foreign ambassadors, Alexander. Strength does not know which fork to use, or how to greet a countess, or how to run an estate with 40 servants. She will learn, Alexander said simply. Learn, Nathaniel repeated, laughing outright now. As though manners can be taught overnight, as though breeding can be replaced with lessons. Cousin, you are not marrying a woman, you are adopting a project. The words landed like a slap, and for the first time, something flickered across Alexander's calm expression. Not doubt about Alina, but disappointment in the family he had grown up believing in. She is not a project, he said, his voice lower now, more dangerous. She is a person, and every one of you standing here tonight mocking her without having met her should be ashamed. No one answered that. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and slowly, guests began finding reasons to drift toward other corners of the ballroom, murmuring behind their hands as they went. Margaret stepped closer to her son, and for a brief moment the harshness in her face softened into something closer to worry. Alexander, she said quietly, I am not trying to hurt you. I am trying to protect you. This world is cruel to those who do not understand its rules. She will be torn apart by it, and you along with her. Then I will stand beside her while she learns, Alexander said. I will not abandon her because the people around me lack the courage to look past where she came from. Margaret's eyes glistened, though whether from anger or sorrow it was impossible to tell. You will regret this decision. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Alexander replied. He turned and walked toward the terrace doors, needing air, needing distance from the whispers that followed him like smoke. Outside, the night was cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the storm he had just walked through. He gripped the stone railing and closed his eyes, letting the noise of the ballroom fade behind him. He thought of Alina as she had been years earlier, when he first crossed paths with her on a night he rarely spoke about. He had been 18 reckless, wandering streets he should never have walked alone, and he had collapsed from exhaustion and fear after narrowly escaping men who meant him harm. A girl no older than himself had found him in an alley behind St. Agnes' home, shivering and disoriented. She had not known who he was. She had not cared that his coat, though torn, was made of fine fabric. She had simply helped him inside, given him warm broth, and sat with him through the night until he could stand on his own legs again. He had tried to repay her the next morning, offering coins from his pocket, but she had refused every one of them. I did not help you for a reward, she had told him, her voice firm despite her small frame. I helped you because you needed it. He had never forgotten those words. Years passed, responsibilities piled upon him, and though he searched quietly for her more than once, fate had not allowed their paths to cross again until recently, when charity work brought him back to St. Agnes' home as an adult, now bearing the title of Duke. She had not recognized him at first, older and dressed in finer clothing than the frightened boy she remembered. But when their eyes met, something in her expression shifted, and slowly, memory returned to both of them at once. From that reunion, everything had unfolded naturally. Conversations that lasted long into the evening, walks through quiet gardens where she spoke without fear of judgment, a friendship that deepened into something neither of them had expected, yet both had welcomed. Alexander opened his eyes and stared out at the dark garden stretching beyond the terrace. Behind him, faint laughter and whispered gossip still echoed from the ballroom, but he no longer cared what they said. He had made his decision, and nothing said tonight would change it. Footsteps approached from behind, soft and familiar. He turned to see his mother standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the dim light. The wedding, she said quietly, when is it to take place? Alexander studied her for a long moment before answering, in 1 month. Margaret's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. She simply nodded once, turned, and walked back into the ballroom, leaving her son alone beneath the stars with only his resolve for company. Inside, the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing minute as guests speculated about the girl from the orphanage who was about to become the next Duchess of Whitmore. None of them yet understood what she was truly capable of. None of them understood that the woman they mocked tonight would, in time, force every one of them to see her differently. But that understanding was still weeks away, and for now, all Alexander could do was stand beneath the cold night sky, holding on to a promise he intended to keep, no matter how loudly his family objected. The letter arrived at St. Agnes' home wrapped in gold ribbon, and the moment Alina Hartley saw it resting on the matron's desk, her stomach tightened with unease. "It is an invitation," said Mrs. Alina Finch, the elderly woman who had raised Alina since she was a small child. She held the envelope carefully as though it might shatter. "From Lady Cordelia Ashworth, a tea gathering held 2 days from now. You are expected to attend." Alina frowned. "I do not know a Lady Cordelia." "She knows you," Mrs. Finch said, her tone careful. "Or rather, she knows of you. Everyone in this city knows of you now, Alina. Word travels fast among people with nothing better to do than gossip." Alina sat down slowly across from the older woman, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She had grown up learning to keep her expression calm, no matter what storm raged inside her. It was a skill she had needed many times over the years, and she suspected she would need it again very soon. "They are curious," Alina said, "or they wish to frighten me away before I even reach the altar." "Perhaps both," Mrs. Finch admitted, "but you do not have to attend, dear. Alexander would understand if you refused." Alina considered this for a long moment, staring at the gold ribbon glinting in the afternoon light. Refusing would be easy. It would also confirm every unkind assumption already circling through drawing rooms and dinner parties across the city, that she was too frightened, too unrefined, too out of place to sit among people of noble birth. "I will go," Alina said finally. Mrs. Finch studied her with something between pride and worry. "You have always had courage, child. Even as a little girl, you never backed away from difficulty. But this world is different from anything you have faced. These people do not fight with fists or hunger. They fight with words, and words can cut just as deep." "I have survived worse than words," Alina said quietly. 2 days later, Alina stood outside the grand townhouse belonging to Lady Cordelia Ashworth, dressed in a pale blue gown that Alexander had insisted on having made for her, though she had chosen the simplest design available, refusing anything overly elaborate. The dress fit well, modest yet elegant, and for a brief moment, staring at her reflection before leaving, she had almost felt as though she belonged in this new world. That feeling vanished the instant she stepped through the front door. The parlor was filled with women in silk and lace, seated in a wide circle with porcelain teacups balanced delicately on their laps. Conversation halted the moment Alina entered, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. Dozens of eyes studied her from head to toe, taking in every detail, searching for flaws to remember and repeat later. Lady Cordelia rose gracefully to greet her, though her smile did not reach her eyes. She was strikingly beautiful, with golden hair arranged in perfect curls and a gown that likely cost more than St. Agnes' home spent feeding its children for an entire year. "Miss Hartley," Cordelia said sweetly, "how wonderful that you could join us. Please sit." Alina took the offered seat near the center of the circle, aware of every whisper passing between the women around her, though none dared speak loudly enough for her to hear the exact words. She recognized the game immediately. It was not so different from the cruelty children sometimes showed one another at the orphanage, only dressed in finer clothing and softer voices. "Tell us," Cordelia said, settling back into her chair with the ease of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "How does one prepare to become a duchess after spending one's life in an orphanage? It must be quite the education." A few women tittered behind their teacups. "I am still learning," Alina answered honestly. "Every day brings something new." "How refreshing," said an older woman near the window, though her tone suggested anything but admiration. "Most young women spend years preparing for society. Etiquette lessons, dancing instruction, language studies. You have had, what, a few weeks?" "A few months," Alina corrected gently. "Ah, months," the woman repeated, exchanging an amused glance with her neighbor. Well, I suppose that will simply have to be enough. Alina kept her hands folded calmly in her lap, though her heart beat faster beneath the surface of her composed expression. She had expected mockery. She had not expected it to feel this personal, this deliberately aimed at unraveling her confidence thread by thread. Cordelia leaned forward slightly, her smile sharpening. I do wonder, Miss Hartley, what it is you truly want from Alexander. Surely you understand how this appears to the rest of us. A penniless orphan suddenly finds herself betrothed to one of the wealthiest men in the country. Forgive my bluntness, but people are asking questions. The room fell silent again, waiting for Alina's response with obvious anticipation, hungry for some crack in her composure they could later describe to friends who had not been present. Alina set down her teacup carefully, meeting Cordelia's gaze without flinching. I understand exactly how it appears, she said. I understand that most of you believe I have manipulated my way into a fortune I do not deserve. I cannot change what you believe, Lady Cordelia. I can only tell you the truth, which is that I never once asked Alexander for anything. He asked for my hand. I did not seek his title nor his wealth. I sought nothing from him at all until he offered his heart, and I chose to accept it. For a moment no one spoke. Cordelia's smile faltered just slightly before she recovered it. How very poetic, she said, though her voice carried less confidence than before. It is not poetry, Alina replied calmly. It is simply the truth. You may believe it or not, Lady Cordelia. That choice belongs entirely to you. The conversation shifted after that, though the underlying tension in the room never fully disappeared. Women continued speaking in careful, pointed sentences, testing Alina's knowledge of etiquette, questioning her understanding of estate management, watching closely for any misstep they could later repeat as proof of her unsuitability. Alina answered each question with quiet patience, admitting when she did not know something rather than pretending otherwise, a choice that seemed to confuse the women more than any false confidence would have. By the time the gathering ended, Alina felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. Walking to the carriage waiting outside, she allowed herself a single deep breath, releasing tension she had held carefully hidden for the entire afternoon. Alexander was waiting for her when she returned to Whitmore Manor, standing near the entrance with visible concern etched across his face. How was it? He asked, taking her hands gently in his own. Difficult, Alina admitted. But I survived. I should not have allowed you to go alone. I needed to go alone, Alina said firmly. If I hide behind you every time someone doubts me, they will never believe I belong here. I need them to see that I can stand on my own. Alexander studied her for a long moment, admiration clear in his expression. You are stronger than any of them realize. They will realize eventually, Alina said, though even she was not entirely certain how true those words would prove to be. Over the following days, Alina threw herself into learning everything she could about the world she was about to enter. She studied etiquette books late into the night, practiced formal greetings until they felt natural, and asked Mrs. Finch endless questions about topics she had never needed to understand while living at the orphanage. Yet despite her efforts, whispers continued to follow her wherever she went. Shopkeepers exchanged knowing glances when she entered their stores. Women on the street lowered their voices as she passed, though not quite low enough to hide their words entirely. She overheard herself described as a fortune hunter, a clever manipulator, a girl who had somehow enchanted a duke foolish enough to fall for a pretty face and a sad story. None of it was true, yet the words still found ways to settle uncomfortably in her chest, no matter how firmly she reminded herself of her own worth. One afternoon, while walking through the market square with Mrs. Finch, Alina overheard two women speaking near a flower stall, unaware she stood close enough to listen. They say she cannot even read properly, one woman said, laughing softly. Imagine a duchess who cannot write her own name. I heard she stole from the orphanage before leaving, the other replied. Coins meant for the younger children. Alina stopped walking, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Mrs. Finch noticed immediately and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Ignore them," she whispered. "Lies feed on silence, but they cannot survive against the truth forever." "How can I ignore lies that paint me as a thief?" Alina asked quietly, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "By becoming so undeniably good that no lie can stand against you," Mrs. Finch answered. "Give them time, Alina. Truth always finds its way to the surface eventually." Alina nodded slowly, though the ache in her chest did not fade entirely. That evening, alone in her room at Whitmore Manor, she sat by the window staring out at the moonlit gardens, replaying the whispered words over and over in her mind. She thought of every child at St. Agnes' home who had once looked up to her, who had trusted her when no one else in their lives had ever offered kindness freely. She thought of the years she had spent working herself past exhaustion, ensuring younger children had enough to eat even when it meant going without herself. She thought of every honest choice she had made, every temptation to take an easier path that she had refused because it conflicted with who she wanted to become. None of that mattered to the women whispering behind flower stalls and teacups. To them, she would always be an outsider, a stain on a family name they believed deserved better. But Alina had survived far worse than gossip. She had survived cold winters with no fire, hungry nights with no food, and years of believing no one in the world truly wanted her. Whispers, however cruel, were nothing compared to that. She straightened her shoulders, wiped away the single tear that had escaped despite her best efforts, and made a quiet promise to herself. She would not run from this world simply because it had not yet learned to accept her. She would stay, she would learn, and eventually she would prove every doubter wrong, not through anger or bitterness, but through quiet, unshakable strength. Outside her window, the gardens of Whitmore Manor stretched peacefully beneath the stars, unaware of the storm still building beyond its walls. Somewhere across the city, tongues continued wagging, spreading rumors that grew more exaggerated with each retelling. And somewhere within Alina herself, a quiet resolve began to harden into something unbreakable, though even she did not yet fully understand how much she would need that strength in the difficult months ahead. The knock on Alina's door came late in the evening, long after the household had settled into quiet, and something about its sharpness told her immediately that this was not a friendly visit. She opened the door to find Charles Whitmore standing in the hallway, his heavy frame filling the doorway, his expression carrying the calm confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "might I have a word?" Alina hesitated only briefly, before stepping aside to let him enter. She had learned enough about Charles over the past weeks to know that refusing him would only delay a conversation he clearly intended to have, one way or another. He walked to the center of her small sitting room, glancing around at the modest furnishings with something close to disdain, as though even the finest guest chamber in Whitmore Manor still smelled faintly of the orphanage she had come from. "I will be direct," Charles said, folding his hands behind his back. "I do not believe this marriage should proceed." "I am aware of your feelings on the matter," Alina replied evenly. "Then you will understand why I have come to offer you a solution." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, holding it out toward her. "A considerable sum of money. Enough to secure a comfortable life far from this city, far from the scrutiny that will only grow worse once you are formally married. You could open a small school, perhaps, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would trouble you with questions about your past." Alina stared at the paper without taking it. "You are offering to pay me to leave your nephew." "I am offering you freedom," Charles corrected, his tone patient, almost kind, though the coldness beneath it remained unmistakable. "Freedom from a life you were never prepared for. Freedom from people who will spend the rest of your days reminding you that you do not belong among them. Is that truly the future you want, Miss Hartley? A lifetime of whispers, of doubt, of never quite fitting into the world you have married into?" For a long moment, Alina said nothing, studying the paper still extended toward her. She thought of every unkind word she had already endured, every whispered insult in shops and drawing rooms, every carefully worded question designed to expose her as unworthy. Charles was not wrong about the difficulty ahead. That much she could not deny. But he was wrong about everything else. "Mr. Whitmore," she said finally, "I did not choose this engagement because I believed it would be easy. I chose it because Alexander is the first person outside of St. Agnes' home who has ever looked at me and seen more than where I came from. You are offering me money to abandon that. I would rather live the rest of my life facing whispers and doubt than live comfortably somewhere, knowing I chose comfort over someone who has never once asked me to be anything other than myself." Charles's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering behind his composed exterior before he masked it once more. "You would refuse a fortune out of sentiment." "I would refuse a fortune because it is not sentiment," Alina said. "It is loyalty. Something I suspect your family has forgotten the meaning of, given how quickly you turned against your own nephew's happiness the moment it became inconvenient." The room fell silent. Charles folded the paper slowly and returned it to his coat, his jaw tightening. "You are making a mistake," he said quietly. "Perhaps," Alina replied. "But it will be my mistake to make, not yours to prevent." Charles left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded entirely. Alina sat down heavily on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation had ended. She had spoken with more confidence than she truly felt, and the effort of maintaining that composure had drained her more than she wanted to admit. She did not tell Alexander about the visit that night. Instead, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many more tests awaited her before this family would finally stop trying to push her away. She did not have to wonder for long. 3 days later, while walking through the manor's east corridor, Alina overheard raised voices coming from behind the closed doors of Alexander's study. She recognized his voice immediately, along with his mother's, both sharpened with tension that suggested the conversation had been building for some time. "You cannot possibly expect me to simply accept this," Margaret was saying, her voice cracking slightly beneath its usual composure. "Everything I have built, everything your father built before he passed, all of it depends on this family maintaining its standing. One misstep, Alexander, and generations of work collapse." "This is not a misstep," Alexander replied firmly. "This is my life, my choice." "Your choice affects all of us," Margaret snapped. "Do you not understand that? Every alliance we have carefully built over the years depends on marriages that strengthen this family's position. What you are doing threatens everything." Alina stood frozen outside the door, uncertain whether to enter or retreat, when Alexander's next words stopped her entirely. "Do you want to know why I refuse to abandon her, mother?" His voice had grown quieter now, though no less intense. "6 years ago, I nearly died in an alley 3 streets from St. Agnes' home. I had gone somewhere I should never have gone, trusted people I should never have trusted, and it nearly cost me my life. I never told you the full truth of that night because I was ashamed. But a girl found me there, bleeding and terrified, and instead of running for help and leaving me alone, she carried me inside herself, tended to my wounds with her own hands, and sat beside me through the entire night, asking nothing in return." Silence followed his words, thick enough that Alina could almost feel it pressing against the door. "That girl was Alina," Alexander continued. "I did not know her name then. I only knew that a stranger with nothing to gain had saved my life, expecting no reward, no recognition, nothing at all. I searched for her for years afterward, and when I finally found her again, I discovered she was exactly the same person I remembered, kind without condition, honest without agenda. Everything this family claims to value, yet somehow fails to recognize when it stands directly in front of us." Margaret's voice, when it finally came, was softer than Alina had ever heard it. "You never told me any of this." "Because it was not about impressing you," Alexander said. "It was about a debt I could never fully repay, and a love that grew from gratitude into something far deeper. I am not marrying Alina out of pity, mother. I am marrying her because she is the finest person I have ever known, and I refuse to let this family's pride convince me otherwise." Alina pressed her hand against her mouth, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. She had never known Alexander carried that memory so deeply, had never realized how much weight that single night had placed upon everything that followed. She stepped back from the door quietly, not wanting to be discovered eavesdropping, and made her way toward the garden instead, needing space to process what she had just heard. The garden was empty at this hour, moonlight spilling across neatly trimmed hedges and quiet stone pathways. Alina walked slowly among the roses, her mind replaying Alexander's words again and again. She had always known their connection ran deep, but hearing him describe it with such raw honesty to his own mother revealed a vulnerability she had not fully understood existed. Footsteps approached from behind, and she turned to find Alexander himself walking toward her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I did not know you were listening," he said quietly. "I did not intend to," Alina admitted. "I am sorry." "Do not apologize." He stepped closer, taking her hands gently in his own. "I should have told you myself long ago how much that night meant to me, how much you meant to me, long before either of us understood what that meant." "You never mentioned it," Alina said softly. "I was ashamed," Alexander admitted. "Ashamed of my own recklessness, ashamed that I needed saving at all. But more than that, I think I feared that if I spoke of it too openly, I might somehow lose the memory of it, turn it into something ordinary instead of the moment that changed everything for me." Alina reached up, gently touching his face. "You have never lost anything by speaking the truth, Alexander, least of all with me." They stood together in the quiet garden for a long while, saying nothing more, simply grateful for each other's presence beneath the wide, star-filled sky. For the first time since the engagement had been announced, Alina felt something shift within her, a quiet confidence settling into place where doubt had lingered before. The following morning, Margaret requested a private meeting with Alina, something that had not occurred since the engagement was first announced. Alina arrived at the small parlor uncertain of what to expect, her nerves tightly wound despite her efforts to remain calm. Margaret sat near the window, her posture as rigid and formal as always, though something in her expression seemed softer than usual. "My son told me about the night in the alley," Margaret said without preamble, "about what you did for him." "He did not need to tell you anything on my behalf," Alina replied carefully. "No," Margaret agreed, "but I am glad he did." She paused, studying Alina with an intensity that made it difficult to look away. "I have spent my entire life believing that titles and bloodlines determine a person's worth. It is how I was raised, and it is how I have raised my son, or attempted to, at least. But you saved his life expecting nothing in return, at a time when you had every reason to walk away and protect yourself instead." "Anyone would have done the same," Alina said quietly. "No," Margaret said firmly, "not anyone. Most people in this world calculate risk before offering kindness. You did not hesitate." She rose slowly from her chair, walking toward the window before turning back to face Alina directly. "I am not yet convinced this marriage will be easy for you. Society will continue testing you, questioning you, searching for reasons to dismiss you as unworthy. That will not change simply because I have softened my opinion." "I did not expect it to," Alina said honestly. "But," Margaret continued, "I am beginning to understand why my son refuses to let you go, and I suppose, in time, I may come to understand it fully myself." It was not an apology, not entirely, but it was the closest thing to acceptance Alina had received since arriving at Whitmore Manor, and she found herself grateful for even that small shift. As the days passed, whispers throughout the city continued, though Alina noticed subtle changes in how she was perceived by those closest to Alexander. Margaret's coldness thawed slightly with each passing week. Even Charles, though he never openly admitted defeat, stopped attempting to interfere directly, watching from a cautious distance instead, as though reevaluating conclusions he had been so certain of before. Only Victoria and Nathaniel remained unmoved, their mockery continuing whenever opportunity allowed, though even their jokes seemed to carry less confidence than before, as though they too sensed the ground shifting beneath assumptions they had never bothered to question. Alina understood, walking through the manor's long corridors each evening, that acceptance would not arrive all at once. It would come slowly, through patience and persistence, through proving again and again that she belonged not because of where she came from, but because of who she had chosen to become despite it. The wedding was now only weeks away, and for the first time since the engagement began, Alina allowed herself to feel something resembling hope, fragile though it remained, that perhaps this family, however reluctant, might one day welcome her not as an outsider forced upon them, but as one of their own. The cathedral bells had barely finished ringing when Alina felt her hands begin to shake. She stood in a small antechamber adjoining the grand cathedral, staring at her own reflection in a tall mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. Her gown, pale ivory silk embroidered with delicate silver thread, had been a gift from Alexander, though she had insisted on simplicity over extravagance. Her dark hair had been carefully arranged by a maid who worked for hours to perfect every curl. She looked, by every outward measure, exactly like a duchess. Yet inside, she felt exactly like the frightened girl who had once slept on a thin mattress at St. Agnes' home, uncertain whether tomorrow would bring another meal. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Finch said from the doorway, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never imagined, when you were a small child crying yourself to sleep, that I would one day see you dressed like this." Alina turned to face her, gratitude swelling in her chest. "I would not be standing here without you." "Nonsense," Mrs. Finch said, waving away the compliment though her smile betrayed how deeply it touched her. "You built this yourself, Alina. Every ounce of strength you carry today, you earned through your own resilience. I merely gave you a roof and a warm meal when I could." "That was everything," Alina said softly. "That was more than enough." A soft knock interrupted the moment, and a servant appeared to announce that the ceremony was about to begin. Alina drew a steadying breath, smoothed the front of her gown, and followed Mrs. Finch toward the cathedral's grand entrance. The doors opened to reveal hundreds of guests seated in orderly rows, their attention immediately fixed upon her. Alina's stomach tightened as she scanned the crowd, recognizing many faces from Lady Cordelia's tea gathering weeks earlier, faces that had questioned her worth with barely concealed contempt. Today, those same faces studied her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment, waiting to see whether the orphan bride would stumble beneath the weight of her own wedding. She would not give them that satisfaction. Alina walked slowly down the long aisle, her chin lifted, her posture straight despite the trembling she fought to hide beneath her calm exterior. She kept her eyes fixed forward, refusing to meet the curious stares surrounding her on either side, until finally her gaze found Alexander waiting at the altar. The moment their eyes met, something inside her steadied completely. He stood tall in formal attire, his expression filled with such open admiration that, for a brief instant, the hundreds of watching guests seemed to disappear entirely. There was no mockery in his eyes, no judgment, only quiet certainty that had never once wavered since the night he first announced his intentions to marry her. By the time Alina reached the altar, her hands had stopped shaking. The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity, the officiant's voice carrying clearly through the vast cathedral as he spoke of commitment, loyalty, and the sacred bond about to be formed between them. Alina listened carefully to each word, aware of the weight they carried, aware that everyone present was watching for any sign of hesitation or doubt. She offered none. When it came time to exchange vows, Alexander spoke first, his voice steady and clear enough to reach every corner of the cathedral. "I stand before all of you today," he began, "not simply to marry the woman I love, but to correct a mistake this world has made in judging her worth by her circumstances rather than her character. Alina has shown me kindness when I had nothing to offer in return. She has shown me strength in the face of cruelty that would have broken lesser spirits. I promise to stand beside her always, against any storm this world attempts to place before us." A murmur passed through the crowd, some guests visibly moved, others exchanging uncertain glances, unsure how to respond to such an open declaration. When Alina spoke her own vows, her voice trembled only slightly before steadying into quiet strength. "I did not grow up believing I would ever stand in a place like this," she said. "I grew up believing that love, security, and belonging were things reserved for other people, people born into circumstances kinder than my own. Alexander showed me otherwise. He looked past everything the world told him to see and found someone worth loving. I promised to spend the rest of my life proving that his faith in me was never misplaced." The cathedral fell silent for a long moment after her words, and Alina wondered briefly whether she had spoken too plainly, too honestly for an audience accustomed to polished formality. But then, unexpectedly, quiet applause began near the back of the cathedral, spreading slowly through the crowd until even some of the most skeptical guests found themselves joining in. Whether from genuine emotion or simple social obligation, Alina could not be certain. The ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange of rings, and when Alexander finally leaned forward to seal their union, the cathedral erupted into applause loud enough to echo off the high stone ceilings. As they turned to face the gathered crowd as husband and wife for the first time, Alina caught sight of Victoria near the front row, her expression carefully neutral, though the tightness around her eyes suggested irritation rather than joy. Nearby, Nathaniel offered polite applause with visibly reluctant hands. Margaret, seated in the front pew, dabbed gently at her eyes with a handkerchief, her expression difficult to read, somewhere between pride and lingering uncertainty. The reception that followed was held in the grand ballroom of Whitmore Manor, transformed for the occasion with elaborate floral arrangements and gleaming chandeliers. Alina moved through the crowd on Alexander's arm, greeting guests with careful poise, aware that every word she spoke, every gesture she made, would be dissected and discussed long after the evening ended. Midway through the celebration, as Alina stood momentarily alone near the refreshment table, Lady Cordelia approached with a glass of champagne in hand, her expression carrying the same polished sweetness Alina remembered from their tea-gathering weeks earlier. "Congratulations, Duchess," Cordelia said, the title landing with deliberate weight. "You have accomplished quite the feat today." "Thank you," Alina replied evenly, refusing to rise to whatever bait lingered beneath the pleasant tone. "I must admit," Cordelia continued, lowering her voice slightly, "I did not believe you would make it this far. Most people assumed the engagement would collapse before reaching the altar. Yet here you stand, Duchess of Whitmore." She raised her glass slightly, as though offering a toast, though her eyes remained cold. "I do wonder how long you will manage to hold onto that title once the excitement of the wedding fades and the true difficulties begin." Alina met her gaze steadily. "I have faced difficulty for as long as I can remember, Lady Cordelia. I do not intend to stop now, simply because I have finally found happiness worth protecting." Cordelia's smile faltered slightly before she recovered it, offering a shallow nod before turning away without further comment. Alina watched her retreat into the crowd, feeling neither triumphant nor troubled, only quietly resolved to continue proving herself, one day at a time, regardless of how many more challenges awaited her. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began departing into the cool night air, Alexander found Alina standing alone on the manor's terrace, gazing out at the moonlit gardens below. "You survived your first official event as my wife," he said, stepping beside her with a gentle smile. "Barely," Alina admitted, though a small laugh escaped her despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. "You did more than survive," Alexander said, taking her hand gently in his own. "You commanded that entire cathedral with nothing but honesty. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life." Alina leaned against him, allowing herself, finally, to relax after weeks of tension and preparation. "Do you think they will ever truly accept me?" she asked quietly. "Not merely tolerate me, but accept me." Alexander considered the question carefully before answering. "I think acceptance rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, through actions rather than words. but I believe, given time, even the most stubborn among them will come to see exactly what I have always seen in you. And if they never do, then we will build a life together regardless, Alexander said firmly. Their approval was never something I required to love you, Alina. It will not become something I require now. Alina smiled softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they stood together beneath the stars, the sounds of departing carriages fading gradually into the quiet night. Whatever challenges awaited them in the months ahead, she felt, for the first time since arriving at Whitmore Manor, genuinely prepared to face them. The wedding had ended, but as both of them understood clearly, the true test of their union was only just beginning. The invitation to the winter charity gala arrived exactly 1 month after the wedding, and Margaret delivered it personally to Alina's study, with an expression that suggested both hope and warning in equal measure. "This event matters a great deal," Margaret said, setting the elegant card on the desk before her. "It is hosted by Lady Beatrice Ashford, my own sister, and it draws the most influential families in the region. If you are to be accepted as Duchess of Whitmore in any meaningful sense, this gathering will be an important step." Alina studied the invitation carefully. "Your sister has not yet met me." "No," Margaret admitted. "And I will be honest with you, Alina. Beatrice has strong opinions, stronger than my own once were. She did not approve of this marriage, and she has made her feelings known through several rather pointed letters." "Then perhaps I should prepare myself for a difficult evening," Alina said, though there was no fear in her voice, only quiet determination. The Winter Charity Gala was held in the Grand Assembly Hall at the center of the city, a building known for hosting the most prestigious gatherings of the season. Alina arrived on Alexander's arm, dressed in deep green silk that complemented her dark hair, her posture composed despite the flutter of nerves beneath her calm exterior. The hall itself was breathtaking, filled with towering arrangements of white roses and silver candelabras casting warm light across a sea of elegantly dressed guests. At the center of it all stood Lady Beatrice Ashford, a striking woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, greeting arrivals with practiced charm that did little to hide the calculation behind her smile. "Duchess," Beatrice said as Alina and Alexander approached, her voice carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to hear clearly. "How wonderful that you could join us this evening. I do hope the transition from your previous life has not proven too overwhelming." "It has been an adjustment," Alina replied evenly, "but a welcome one." "How gracious of you to say so." Beatrice's smile sharpened slightly. "Tell me, before we begin the evening's proceedings, are you familiar with the purpose of tonight's gathering? This gala raises funds for several charitable institutions across the region, including a few homes for orphan children, much like the one you yourself grew up in." A ripple of interest passed through the nearby guests, several turning to listen more closely, sensing the direction of Beatrice's carefully chosen words. "I am aware," Alina said calmly. "I received a description of the evening's program before arriving." "Wonderful," Beatrice continued, her tone deceptively pleasant. "Then perhaps you might join our committee this evening as we discuss funding allocations. It occurred to me that your unique background might offer valuable insight, though I confess I wonder whether your understanding extends beyond personal experience into practical matters of finance and administration." The implication was unmistakable, delivered with enough polish to seem almost like a genuine invitation, though everyone within earshot understood it as a test designed to expose Alina's limitations in front of the city's most influential families. Alexander tensed beside her, ready to intervene, but Alina gently touched his arm, a silent request for him to allow her to answer on her own. "I would be honored to join the discussion," Alina said. Beatrice's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly having expected refusal or discomfort rather than confident acceptance. "Very well then, follow me." The committee gathered in a smaller adjoining room, seated around a long table covered with ledgers, funding proposals, and detailed reports outlining the financial needs of various charitable institutions throughout the region. Several wealthy patrons sat alongside Beatrice, along with a stern-faced accountant responsible for reviewing the numbers before any decisions were finalized. "We are currently reviewing proposals from 4 separate orphanages," Beatrice explained, sliding a stack of papers toward the center of the table. "Each institution has submitted requests for funding, though our resources this year are unfortunately limited. We must decide which proposals deserve priority." Alina reached for the papers without hesitation, scanning through them carefully while the rest of the committee watched with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. "This proposal from St. Margaret's Home requests funding primarily for building repairs," Alina said after several minutes of study. "Yet their attached records show declining enrollment over the past 3 years. Meanwhile, this proposal from Willowbrook Home requests significantly less funding, but their records indicate rising enrollment and insufficient bedding, clothing, and medical supplies for the children currently in their care." Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "And your recommendation?" "Building repairs matter," Alina said, "but children without proper bedding through winter months face far more immediate danger than children in a building requiring cosmetic improvements. I would recommend prioritizing Willowbrook's request this year, while perhaps allocating a smaller portion towards St. Margaret's most urgent structural needs, specifically their roof, which their report mentions is currently leaking directly above sleeping quarters." The accountant, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, glanced up from his ledgers with obvious surprise. "That is precisely the concern I raised earlier this week, though I struggled to convince the rest of the committee of its urgency." "Children cannot learn, cannot grow, cannot thrive," Alina continued, "if their most basic needs remain unmet. I spent years watching younger children shiver through winter nights because our own home could not always afford enough blankets. I understand exactly how quickly a lack of proper supplies can turn from inconvenience into genuine crisis." Silence settled over the table as several committee members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for the depth of practical understanding Alina had just demonstrated. "You speak as though you have managed budgets before," one of the wealthy patrons remarked, his tone carrying reluctant curiosity rather than outright dismissal. "I have," Alina said simply. "For the final 3 years before I left St. Agnes Home, I assisted Mrs. Finch in managing our limited funds, deciding how best to stretch every coin between food, clothing, medicine, and repairs. It was not glamorous work, but it taught me more about practical finance than any etiquette lesson ever could." Beatrice studied Alina for a long moment, her earlier confidence visibly shaken, though she attempted to mask it behind continued composure. "Well," she said finally, "it seems your background has proven more useful than I anticipated." "Circumstances are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside, Lady Beatrice," Alina replied, her tone carrying no bitterness, only quiet confidence. The committee ultimately adopted Alina's recommendation, allocating the majority of available funds toward Willowbrook Home's immediate needs, while setting aside a smaller portion for urgent structural repairs at St. Margaret's. As the meeting concluded and guests began filing back toward the main ballroom, several committee members approached Alina directly, offering genuine compliments on her practical insight, a stark contrast to the polite skepticism that had greeted her only an hour earlier. Word of the meeting spread quickly through the gala, whispered between guests with considerably more respect than the whispers that had followed Alina throughout previous weeks. By the time she returned to the main ballroom on Alexander's arm, several guests who had previously avoided direct conversation now approached with genuine curiosity, asking questions about her recommendations, her experiences, her perspective on charitable work that most of them had only ever viewed from a comfortable distance. Beatrice found Alina again near the end of the evening, standing somewhat apart from the crowd, studying her with an expression far more thoughtful than the sharp calculation she had displayed earlier. "I underestimated you," Beatrice admitted quietly, her earlier hostility noticeably absent. "I assumed, given your background, that you would struggle to keep pace with matters of finance and administration. Instead, you demonstrated more practical wisdom than half the committee combined, myself included. Thank you, Alina said simply. I will not pretend my concerns about this marriage have entirely disappeared, Beatrice continued honestly. This world remains difficult for those who enter it from circumstances different from our own. But I believe, perhaps, that difficulty does not necessarily mean impossibility. It was not full acceptance. Alina understood, but it represented genuine progress, earned not through pleading or apology, but through simply demonstrating her worth in a language this world could not easily dismiss. Later that night, riding home in the carriage beside Alexander, Alina finally allowed herself to relax completely, the tension of the evening slowly draining from her shoulders. You were remarkable tonight, Alexander said, watching her with quiet admiration. I do not think even I fully understood how skilled you were at managing practical matters until I watched you handle that committee. I spent years learning to stretch very little into enough, Alina said. It seems that knowledge has finally proven useful beyond the walls of St. Agnes' home. It has proven more than useful, Alexander said. You changed how an entire room of influential people view you in the span of a single evening. Alina smiled softly, leaning against him as the carriage rolled steadily through the quiet city streets toward Whitmore Manor. One evening will not undo months of doubt, she said, but perhaps it is a beginning. It is more than a beginning, Alexander replied, taking her hand gently in his own. It is proof, Alina, that everything I have believed about you from the very start was true. You do not need this world's approval to be exceptional. You simply need the opportunity to show them what I have always known. Outside the carriage window, the city passed by in a blur of lamplight and quiet streets, carrying them steadily homeward. For the first time since her wedding day, Alina felt something settle firmly within her, not quite triumph, but something close to it, a quiet confidence that the difficult path ahead, while far from finished, had finally begun tilting in her favor. Yet even as she allowed herself this small measure of relief, she remained unaware of the storm quietly gathering elsewhere in the city, where a determined journalist had already begun asking questions about her past, questions that would soon threaten to unravel everything she had worked so carefully to build. The knock at Whitmore Manor's front entrance came just after breakfast, and the moment the butler announced a journalist requesting an audience with the Duke, Alina felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. His name is Henry Cole, the butler said, presenting a small card on a silver tray. He writes for the City Gazette. He claims to have information regarding the Duchess's past that he wishes to discuss before publishing. Alexander's expression darkened immediately. Send him away. Wait, Alina said, rising from her chair. Let him speak. Hiding from this will only make it appear as though we have something to fear. Alexander studied her carefully before nodding, though the tension in his shoulders remained visible. Show him to the drawing room, he instructed the butler. We will hear what he has to say. Henry Cole entered moments later, a lean man with sharp, observant eyes and a notebook tucked beneath his arm. He offered a polite bow before settling into the chair Alexander gestured toward, though his gaze lingered on Alina with obvious curiosity. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Cole began. I will be direct, as I believe directness serves everyone best in situations such as this. I have spent the past several weeks investigating the Duchess's history prior to her marriage, following rumors that have circulated throughout the city since the engagement was first announced. What sort of rumors? Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. Various claims, Cole said, some suggesting theft from St. Agnes' home. Others suggesting the Duchess deliberately orchestrated her relationship with you for financial gain. I do not repeat these claims because I believe them, Your Grace. I repeat them because my editor insists on a story regardless of what I discover, and I would rather publish truth than speculation. Alina felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression composed. And what have you discovered, Mr. Cole? Cole opened his notebook, flipping through several pages before continuing. I spent considerable time at St. Agnes' home, speaking with the matron, Mrs. Finch, along with several older children who remember you well, Duchess. What I discovered was rather different from the rumors currently circulating through the city. Different how? Alexander asked. For the past 4 years, Cole said, records at St. Agnes' home show consistent anonymous donations arriving every month, substantial enough to cover the cost of proper bedding, medical supplies, and additional food for the children living there. Mrs. Finch could not identify the source of these donations, though she suspected they came from a wealthy benefactor wishing to remain anonymous. Alina's hands tightened slightly in her lap, though she said nothing, waiting for Cole to continue. After considerable investigation, Cole said, I traced the source of these donations to a small seamstress shop on the eastern edge of the city, where records show a young woman working long hours for several years, earning wages that were then redirected, nearly in their entirety, back toward St. Agnes' home. He looked up from his notebook, meeting Alina's gaze directly. That young woman, according to the shop's records, was you, Duchess. Alexander turned toward Alina, surprise evident across his face. You never mentioned this. Alina hesitated for a long moment before answering. I did not think it mattered to anyone beyond myself, and the children it helped. You spent years of your own earnings, Cole said, funding the very institution that raised you, all while working exhausting hours as a seamstress, long before you ever met the Duke or had any expectation of the life you now lead. This does not match the story currently circulating through this city, Duchess. This is not the story of a woman scheming for wealth. This is the story of a woman who gave away nearly everything she earned to ensure children she had once shared a home with did not suffer the same hardships she once endured. Alina remained quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts carefully. I did not do it for recognition, Mr. Cole. I did it because I remembered what it felt like to go without, and I could not, in good conscience, enjoy comfort while children I cared about continued suffering nearby. May I ask, Cole said gently, why you never told anyone, even after your engagement was announced, even as rumors painted you as a fortune hunter, you said nothing about this? Because kindness offered for recognition is not truly kindness, Alina said simply. It becomes performance. I did not want my past generosity used as a shield against present accusations. I wanted it to remain what it always was, a private choice made for the right reasons, not a defense strategy. Cole studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his sharp eyes, admiration replacing the professional detachment he had carried into the room. That is, without question, the most honest answer I have received in my entire career as a journalist. What will you write? Alexander asked. The truth, Cole said, closing his notebook firmly. Every detail I have uncovered presented exactly as I found it. I believe this city deserves to know the real story behind the woman they have spent months mocking without ever bothering to learn who she truly is. 3 days later, the City Gazette published Cole's article on its front page, detailing Alina's years of quiet sacrifice, her tireless work supporting St. Agnes' home long before wealth or title ever entered her life. The article included testimonials from Mrs. Finch, from several children Alina had once cared for, and from the seamstress shop's owner, who described Alina as the most dedicated worker she had ever employed, always first to arrive and last to leave, always setting aside the majority of her modest wages for reasons she never fully explained until now. The response throughout the city was immediate and dramatic. Shopkeepers who had once exchanged knowing glances now spoke of Alina with genuine admiration. Women who had whispered cruel rumors behind flower stalls found themselves confronted by neighbors questioning why they had ever believed such claims. Even Lady Cordelia, upon reading the article, sent a brief but formal letter of apology, acknowledging that her earlier assumptions had been unfair and unfounded. Margaret arrived at Alina's study the morning the article circulated, holding a copy of the newspaper with an expression Alina had never seen on her before, something close to genuine emotion breaking through her usually composed exterior. "Why did you never tell me?" Margaret asked quietly. "I did not believe it would change anything," Alina admitted. "Words rarely convince people who have already made up their minds. I hoped, eventually, that my actions might speak clearly enough on their own." Margaret sat down slowly across from her, folding the newspaper carefully in her lap. "I judged you the moment Alexander announced his intentions, based entirely on assumptions I never bothered questioning. I'm not proud of that, Alina. I built my entire understanding of worth around bloodlines and titles, and in doing so, I nearly drove away the most genuinely good person my son has ever brought into this family." "You were protecting what you believed mattered," Alina said gently. "I do not hold that against you." "You should," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "You endured months of cruelty from people who never gave you a fair chance, myself included. That deserves more than quiet forgiveness." Alina reached across the small table, gently taking Margaret's hand in her own. "Forgiveness does not require punishment first, Margaret. I would rather build something new between us than dwell on what has already passed." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she studied Alina carefully, something shifting permanently in her expression. "You truly are remarkable," she said quietly. "I only wish I had recognized it sooner." Over the following weeks, the transformation throughout the city continued steadily. Invitations arrived at Whitmore Manor from families who had previously ignored Alina entirely, now eager to include her in social gatherings, charitable committees, and community events. Alina approached each invitation with the same quiet grace she had shown from the very beginning, neither seeking validation from her newfound acceptance nor holding resentment toward those who had once doubted her. Yet not everyone within the family had softened toward her. Victoria and Nathaniel remained noticeably distant during this period, their earlier mockery replaced with cautious silence rather than genuine warmth. Alina noticed their continued coldness, but chose not to press the matter, understanding that some transformations required more time than others. She could not have known, however, that their resistance stemmed from something far more concerning than simple stubbornness. A secret concern regarding the family's finances that would soon threaten to unravel everything Alina had worked so carefully to rebuild. One evening, several weeks after Cole's article had first circulated, Alina overheard a tense conversation between Charles and Alexander behind the closed doors of the study, their voices carrying an urgency she had not heard since her earliest days at Whitmore Manor. "The investments have failed," Charles was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Every one of them, Alexander. We stand to lose nearly everything within the year if a solution is not found quickly." Alina stood frozen in the hallway, her earlier relief giving way to fresh uncertainty. The acceptance she had fought so hard to earn now felt suddenly fragile, threatened by a crisis she did not yet fully understand, but one that would soon demand everything she had learned throughout her difficult years at St. Agnes' home, and perhaps far more besides. The family gathered in the great hall the following evening, faces pale with worry, voices hushed with the weight of news that threatened everything they had spent generations building. Charles stood near the fireplace, papers scattered across the long table before him, his usually confident demeanor replaced by visible strain. "The investments in the northern shipping ventures have collapsed entirely," he explained, his voice tight. "Combined with the failed harvest on our eastern properties this season, we are facing losses that could threaten the entire estate within the year, perhaps sooner." Margaret pressed a trembling hand against her chest. "How is this possible? You assured us these investments were secure." "They were considered sound at the time," Charles said defensively. "No one could have predicted the shipping disaster, nor the drought that ruined this season's harvest." "What can be done?" Alexander asked, his jaw tight with concern. "Very little, I fear," Charles admitted. "We could sell portions of the eastern estate, though that would diminish our standing considerably. We could seek loans from other noble families, though word of our difficulties would spread quickly, damaging our reputation beyond repair. Neither option offers a clean solution." Victoria, seated near the window, spoke up with unusual sharpness. This is precisely what happens when priorities shift away from tradition. We have spent this entire year focused on scandal and gossip surrounding an unsuitable marriage, while the true foundation of this family crumbled beneath our notice. The implication in her words was unmistakable, and several eyes turned toward Alina, who stood quietly near the entrance, having been summoned to the gathering only moments earlier. "You believe my marriage caused this crisis?" Alina asked calmly, refusing to let the accusation rattle her. "I believe," Victoria said coldly, "that this family's attention has been consumed by matters far beneath its true concerns, while genuine threats to our survival went unnoticed." "That is unfair," Alexander said firmly, stepping toward Alina protectively. "Perhaps," Alina said, placing a gentle hand on his arm before he could continue defending her further, "but arguing over blame will not solve the problem before us. May I see the reports, Mr. Whitmore?" Charles hesitated, glancing toward Margaret uncertainly before finally gesturing toward the scattered papers. "I do not see how this concerns you directly, Duchess, but you are welcome to review them if you wish." Alina approached the table and began sorting through the documents methodically, her expression focused as she studied figures, dates, and detailed accounts of the family's various financial holdings. The room fell into tense silence as minutes passed, broken only by the soft rustle of papers and the crackle of the fireplace. "Your shipping losses," Alina said finally, "total considerably more than your harvest losses, correct?" "Yes," Charles confirmed, watching her with cautious curiosity now rather than dismissal. "And these remaining properties here," Alina continued, pointing toward a separate ledger. "The smaller holdings in the southern district, these have consistently produced modest but stable income over the past several years, according to these records." "They have," Charles admitted, "though the income is far too small to offset our current losses." "Perhaps not alone," Alina said, "but combined with a different approach, they might provide exactly the foundation needed to recover." She looked up, meeting the eyes of everyone gathered in the room. "May I propose something?" Charles exchanged a skeptical glance with Margaret before nodding cautiously. "Go ahead." "Rather than selling portions of the eastern estate outright," Alina said, "which would diminish both your income and your standing permanently, consider leasing sections of that land instead to local farmers and merchants who lack the capital to purchase land themselves, but possess the skills to make it productive. You retain ownership, they invest their labor and expertise, and you receive steady rental income without sacrificing the family's holdings entirely." Charles frowned thoughtfully. "That would require considerable time to establish, and the income would be gradual rather than immediate." "True," Alina acknowledged, "which is why it should be combined with a second measure. These southern properties, though modest, could be expanded through smaller, more affordable investments rather than the large speculative ventures that led to this crisis. I have seen firsthand, managing very limited resources at St. Agnes Home, how steady, careful growth often outperforms large, risky gambles in the long run. Small, consistent gains compound over time into genuine stability." "And the immediate crisis?" Margaret asked. "The debts requiring payment within the coming months?" Alina paused, considering carefully before continuing. "I would suggest reaching out to smaller, less prominent lenders rather than other noble families. Merchant banks, for instance, who value discretion and reliable repayment over public prestige. The interest rates may be somewhat higher, but the damage to the family's reputation would be considerably less than seeking loans from rival noble houses who might use this vulnerability against you socially." Charles stared at Alina for a long moment, clearly reassessing everything he had previously believed about her capabilities. "This is remarkably sound thinking, Duchess. I confess, I did not expect such practical financial insight." "I spent years learning to survive on very little," Alina said simply. "Scarcity teaches lessons that abundance rarely does. When you have almost nothing, you learn quickly how to make the most of what remains, and how to avoid unnecessary risk that could cost you everything." Alexander watched his wife with quiet pride, as the rest of the family slowly absorbed her proposal, the earlier tension in the room gradually giving way to cautious hope. "I will need to review the specific terms carefully," Charles said after a long moment, "but this approach has genuine merit. I confess, Duchess, I have underestimated you considerably since your arrival in this family." "You are not the first," Elena said, though there was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet acknowledgement of the long road she had already traveled. Over the following weeks, Elena worked closely alongside Charles, reviewing contracts, negotiating lease agreements with local farmers, and carefully identifying smaller investment opportunities that offered steady growth without excessive risk. Her practical understanding of managing scarce resources, honed through years of necessity at St. Agnes' home, proved invaluable in ways even Alexander had not fully anticipated. Margaret, once resistant to nearly every aspect of Elena's presence in the family, now sought her opinion regularly on matters both financial and social, a transformation that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Even Charles, gruff and skeptical by nature, began treating Elena with genuine respect, occasionally seeking her counsel on decisions entirely unrelated to the current crisis. Only Victoria remained resistant, watching the family's gradual recovery with an expression that suggested discomfort rather than relief. One afternoon, several weeks into the recovery efforts, Elena found her alone in the manor's library, staring out the window with an unreadable expression. "You do not approve of these changes," Elena said gently, approaching cautiously. Victoria turned, startled, before composing herself quickly. "It is not that I disapprove," she said stiffly. "It is simply difficult, watching someone I dismissed so completely prove herself more capable than I ever imagined." "You do not need to apologize," Elena said. "I understand how difficult it can be, admitting we misjudged someone." Victoria studied her for a long moment, something shifting slightly behind her guarded expression. "I have spent my entire life believing that worth comes from birth, from title, from inherited privilege. Watching you save this family, using skills you were forced to develop through hardship none of us ever had to endure, it forces me to question everything I once believed certain." "Questioning old beliefs is not weakness," Elena said. "It is often the beginning of genuine understanding." Victoria said nothing more, though something in her posture softened slightly before she excused herself from the room. It was not reconciliation, not entirely, but it represented a crack in the resistance that had remained unmoved since the very beginning, a small sign that perhaps even the most stubborn members of this family were slowly beginning to see Elena clearly for the first time. By the following season, the family's finances had stabilized considerably, the crisis that once threatened generations of accumulated wealth gradually giving way to cautious but genuine recovery. The leased lands began producing steady rental income. The smaller investments Elena had recommended showed early signs of reliable growth. And the merchant bank loans, arranged quietly and discreetly, allowed the family to meet its immediate obligations without damaging its public reputation. Word of Elena's role in saving the family's finances spread quietly through the household staff and eventually into wider social circles, adding yet another layer to the transformation of her reputation throughout the city. No longer was she whispered about as an opportunistic orphan who had somehow deceived her way into wealth. Increasingly, she was spoken of with genuine admiration, as a woman whose practical wisdom and quiet resilience had proven more valuable to this ancient family than generations of careful breeding ever had. Alexander found her late one evening in the manor's study, reviewing the latest financial reports with quiet satisfaction visible in her expression. "You saved this family," he said softly, sitting beside her. "We saved this family," Elena corrected gently. "Together, alongside your uncle's willingness to finally listen to perspectives outside his own experience." "Regardless," Alexander said, taking her hand gently in his own, "I do not think anyone in this house will ever again question whether you belong here." Elena smiled softly, leaning against him as the evening settled peacefully around them. The road toward acceptance had been long, filled with cruelty, doubt, and countless moments where giving up might have seemed easier than continuing forward. Yet here she remained, not merely tolerated but genuinely valued, her worth finally recognized not through inherited privilege, but through the quiet strength she had carried with her since childhood, strength that had, in the end, proven more powerful than any title or bloodline this family had ever possessed. A full year had passed since the wedding, and the grand hall of Whitmore Manor buzzed with laughter and conversation as the family gathered for the annual harvest celebration. A tradition Alina had revived after learning it had quietly faded away decades earlier. She stood near the long banquet table, overseeing final preparations with the practiced ease of someone who had spent an entire year learning every corner of this world she had once feared she would never truly belong to. Servants moved efficiently around her, following instructions she had given calmly and clearly, a stark contrast to the uncertain young woman who had first arrived at this manor, terrified of making even the smallest mistake. "Everything looks wonderful," Margaret said, appearing at her side with a warm smile that had become increasingly familiar over the past months. "You have outdone yourself, Alina." "I had considerable help," Alina replied modestly, though she could not fully hide the quiet pride in her voice. "Nonsense," Margaret said firmly. "This celebration exists because you insisted on reviving traditions the rest of us had long forgotten. You have brought life back into this house, in more ways than one." Alina smiled, genuinely touched by the compliment, remembering how different their relationship had been only a year earlier, when Margaret's words carried nothing but doubt and quiet disapproval. Now, standing together preparing for a celebration neither of them could have imagined sharing 12 months ago, the distance between those two moments felt almost impossible to measure. Guests began arriving as evening settled over the manor, filling the great hall with warmth, laughter, and the comfortable chatter of a household finally at peace with itself. Alina moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting familiar faces, many of whom had once regarded her with suspicion, but now approached with genuine warmth and respect. Near the center of the hall, she found Lady Beatrice Ashford deep in conversation with several other prominent women, all of them listening intently as Beatrice described, with visible admiration, the charitable committee's recent success funding improvements at 3 separate orphanages throughout the region, improvements guided largely by strategies Alina herself had helped design. "Duchess," Beatrice called warmly upon noticing her, "do join us. I was just explaining how your insight transformed our entire approach to charitable funding this year." Alina joined the conversation gracefully, contributing thoughtful observations that the other women listened to with genuine interest rather than the polite skepticism she had once endured. The transformation felt almost surreal at times, remembering how coldly this same circle of women had once regarded her. Yet here she stood now, respected not despite her humble beginnings, but because of the wisdom those beginnings had taught her. Across the hall, Alina noticed Victoria watching the gathering with an expression far softer than the guarded coldness she had carried throughout the previous year. Their relationship had healed slowly, built through small moments of genuine connection rather than any single dramatic reconciliation. Victoria approached now, offering a warm smile that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. "The celebration is beautiful," Victoria said. "You have a gift for bringing people together, Alina. I do not think I ever properly acknowledged that." "Thank you, Victoria," Alina replied warmly. "I am simply glad we have found our way to this point." "As am I," Victoria admitted. "I spent so long believing that worth came only from birth and title that I nearly missed recognizing genuine goodness standing directly in front of me. I am grateful you were patient enough to allow me the time to understand that mistake." The two women embraced briefly, a gesture that would have seemed unthinkable during those early, difficult months, yet now felt entirely natural, a quiet testament to how thoroughly time and honesty had reshaped relationships that once seemed permanently broken. As the evening progressed, Alexander found Alina near the terrace doors, taking a brief moment of quiet away from the celebration's cheerful noise. He wrapped his arms gently around her from behind, resting his chin softly against her shoulder as they both gazed out at the moonlit gardens below. "A year ago tonight," he said quietly, "half the guests in that room would have refused to even speak with you directly." "A great deal has changed," Alina agreed softly. "You changed it," Alexander said. "Through nothing but patience, honesty, and quiet strength. I do not think I have ever admired anyone more in my entire life." Alina turned to face him, her expression soft with genuine emotion. "We changed it together, Alexander. Your faith in me, even when the rest of your family doubted everything about my presence here, gave me the courage to keep proving myself day after day, even when it felt impossibly difficult." "I never doubted you," Alexander said firmly. "Not for a single moment." They stood together quietly for a while longer, watching the garden sway gently beneath the evening breeze, before returning to the celebration still unfolding warmly within the grand hall. Later that evening, as the celebration reached its peak, Alexander rose to address the gathered guests, tapping gently against his glass to draw everyone's attention. The room quieted gradually, faces turning toward him with curious anticipation. "1 year ago," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, "I stood in this very room and announced my intention to marry a woman many of you believed unworthy of joining this family. I understand now, looking back, why that announcement caused such alarm. This family has spent centuries building its reputation around bloodlines, titles, and inherited privilege. Alina possessed none of those things when she first arrived among us." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the crowd, though it carried warmth rather than mockery this time, an acknowledgement of how far the entire family had traveled since that tense evening a year earlier. "What Alina did possess," Alexander continued, "was something far more valuable than any of those inherited advantages. She possessed unshakable integrity, quiet strength forged through genuine hardship, and a heart capable of extraordinary kindness even toward those who treated her unkindly in return. Over this past year, she has proven, time and again, that true worth has never depended on where a person comes from, but entirely on who they choose to become despite their circumstances." Alina felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened, overwhelmed by the sincerity in her husband's voice, carrying clearly across a room filled with people who had once dismissed her so completely. "She saved this family from financial ruin through practical wisdom none of the rest of us possessed," Alexander continued. "She transformed how this family approaches charitable work throughout the region. She earned the genuine respect and affection of people who once mocked her openly, not through demands or arguments, but through quiet, consistent proof of her own remarkable character." He turned, meeting Alina's eyes directly across the room, his expression filled with open admiration and love. "I did not choose a duchess a year ago," he said softly, though his voice still carried clearly through the silent hall. "I chose the right person, someone whose worth was never determined by titles or bloodlines, but by character that this entire family has since come to recognize and cherish. To my wife, Alina, who has taught all of us far more about true nobility than any lesson our ancestors ever passed down." He raised his glass high, and the room followed immediately, dozens of voices rising together in warm celebration. "To Alina," Alexander said, "Duchess of Whitmore, and the finest person I have ever had the privilege of knowing." "To Alina," the room echoed, glasses raised high, applause breaking out warmly across the hall. Alina crossed the room slowly, overwhelmed by emotion, meeting Alexander at the center of the gathering as guests continued applauding around them. He took her hands gently in his own, pulling her close. "Thank you," she whispered, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. "There is nothing to thank me for," Alexander replied softly. "I simply spoke the truth this family has finally learned to see clearly." Later that night, long after the celebration had ended and guests had departed into the cool evening air, Alina stood alone on the manor's terrace, gazing out at the peaceful garden stretching beneath a sky full of stars. She thought back to that frightened girl who had once slept in a small, crowded room at St. Agnes' home, uncertain whether she would ever find a place in this world where she truly belonged. She thought of every whispered insult she had endured, every carefully worded test designed to expose her as unworthy, every moment of doubt that had threatened to overwhelm her resolve. None of that difficulty had disappeared entirely from her memory, nor did she wish it to. Those struggles had shaped her into the woman standing here tonight, strong enough to overcome cruelty without losing her own kindness in the process. Footsteps approached softly from behind, and Alexander joined her at the terrace railing, wrapping a warm arm gently around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "Everything that brought me here," Elena said softly. "Every difficult moment that once felt impossible to overcome." "Any regrets?" Alexander asked gently. Elena considered the question carefully before shaking her head. "None," she said firmly. "Every difficulty taught me something valuable. Every doubter who underestimated me gave me the chance to prove them wrong, not through anger but through quiet persistence. I would not trade that journey for an easier path, even if one had been offered to me." Alexander pulled her closer, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead. "I am endlessly grateful this journey led you to me," he said softly. "As am I," Elena whispered, resting peacefully against him beneath the vast, star-filled sky. Somewhere across the city, St. Agnes' home continued its quiet work, sheltering children who had nowhere else to turn, unaware that the woman who had once walked those same halls now stood as one of the most respected figures throughout the entire region, her story quietly inspiring anyone who dared believe that circumstances of birth need never determine the limits of what a person could ultimately become. The family that had once mocked her so openly now proudly claimed her as one of their own, not out of obligation, but through genuine admiration earned slowly, honestly, through months of quiet strength and unwavering integrity. And as Elena stood there in the peaceful moonlight, finally at rest after a year of extraordinary challenges, she understood with quiet certainty that she had not merely survived this difficult journey. She had triumphed over it entirely, transforming doubt into admiration, cruelty into respect, and an uncertain beginning into a future brighter than anything she had ever dared imagine during those long, difficult years at St. Agnes' home. 5 years passed, and the small gray building on the edge of the city no longer looked quite so small, nor quite so gray. St. Agnes' home for orphan children now stood freshly painted, its roof repaired, its windows replaced, its once empty courtyard filled with children playing beneath a row of newly planted trees. Elena walked through the front gate on a bright spring morning, her presence immediately drawing a crowd of excited young faces rushing toward her. "Duchess Elena," one small girl called out, tugging eagerly at her sleeve. "Did you bring the books you promised?" "I did," Elena said, laughing warmly as she knelt down to the child's level. "A whole crate of them waiting in the carriage. You will need to help me carry them inside." The children cheered, several racing ahead toward the carriage while others clustered around Elena, chattering eagerly about lessons, games, and the small garden they had recently planted along the courtyard's edge. Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway, considerably grayer than she had been years earlier, though her eyes remained just as sharp and warm as ever. "You spoil them," Mrs. Finch said, though her smile betrayed how much she appreciated the gesture. "I spoil them exactly as much as you once spoiled me," Elena replied, embracing the older woman warmly. "Which is to say, not nearly enough but always with love." Over the following hour, Elena walked through the home she had once called her own, noting every improvement made possible through the foundation she had established shortly after her financial work with the Whitmore family finances had proven successful. What began as a small effort to support St. Agnes' home had grown steadily over the years into a broader charitable network, funding improvements at orphanages throughout the entire region, guided always by the same practical wisdom Elena had first demonstrated at Lady Beatrice's charity committee years earlier. Young women who had grown up within these walls, much like Alina herself, now returned regularly to teach, mentor, and support the next generation of children who found themselves without family or fortune. Several had gone on to become seamstresses, teachers, and shopkeepers throughout the city, building independent lives that would have seemed impossible without the foundation's steady support during their most vulnerable years. "You built something remarkable here," came a familiar voice from the doorway, and Alina turned to find Alexander watching her with quiet pride, having arrived to collect her for their journey home. "We built it together," Alina reminded him gently, echoing words she had spoken many times over the years. "Your family's resources made this possible. My understanding of what these children truly need shaped how those resources were used." Alexander smiled, crossing the courtyard to join her. "Charles mentioned this morning that the Foundation's work has expanded beyond even our own region now. 3 additional orphanages in neighboring counties have requested guidance in establishing similar programs." "Then we shall help them," Alina said simply, as though the matter required no further discussion. Their journey home that afternoon carried them past familiar streets, through a city that had changed considerably in its perception of Alina over the years. Shopkeepers who once whispered rumors now greeted her warmly by name. Women who had mocked her at tea gatherings now sought her counsel on charitable committees throughout the region. The transformation had not happened overnight, nor had it come without continued effort, but 5 years of consistent, honest work had reshaped how an entire city understood her worth. At Whitmore Manor, Alina found Margaret in the garden, tending carefully to a section of roses she had cultivated herself over recent years, a hobby she had taken up only after growing close to Alina, who had once mentioned how much she admired the simple beauty of well-tended flowers during her earliest, most difficult days in this family. "The children at St. Agnes send their regards," Alina said, settling onto a nearby bench. Margaret looked up, smiling warmly. "How are they faring?" "Wonderfully," Alina said. "Little Grace has taken quite an interest in reading. She reminds me of myself at that age, always searching for stories that might carry her somewhere beyond those walls, even if only in her imagination." "You gave her that opportunity," Margaret said, "just as someone once gave it to you." Alina nodded thoughtfully, watching her mother-in-law continue tending the roses with practiced care. Their relationship, once defined entirely by suspicion and coldness, had grown over the years into genuine affection, built through countless quiet moments much like this one, moments neither of them could have imagined sharing during those tense early months following the wedding. That evening, the extended family gathered for dinner, a now comfortable tradition that included not only Alexander's immediate relatives, but increasingly, several close friends Alina had made throughout her charitable work over the years. Charles, now considerably softer in temperament than the stern financial advisor who had once attempted to bribe Alina into leaving the family, spoke animatedly about the Foundation's continued growth, clearly proud of contributions he had once resisted so firmly. Victoria, seated beside her own husband, a kind gentleman she had married 2 years earlier, listened with genuine interest as Alina described the newest challenges facing the Foundation's expansion into neighboring counties. Their friendship, forged slowly through years of honest conversation, had become one of the most meaningful relationships in Alina's life, a transformation neither woman could have predicted during those earliest, most difficult months. Even Nathaniel, though he remained somewhat reserved by nature, had grown genuinely respectful toward Alina over the years, occasionally offering practical business advice that complemented her own charitable efforts, a partnership neither of them would have believed possible 5 years earlier. As dinner concluded, and the family gradually dispersed into quiet evening activities, Alexander found Alina once more on the terrace, a place that had become their favorite spot for quiet reflection over the years, filled with countless memories both difficult and joyful. "Do you ever think back to that first night?" Alexander asked softly, settling beside her. "When my mother nearly fainted upon hearing my announcement." Alina laughed softly, the memory now carrying warmth rather than pain. Often, she admitted. It seems impossible now, remembering how frightened I was, how certain I felt that I would never truly belong in this family. And now? Alexander asked. Now, Alina said, resting her head gently against his shoulder. I understand that belonging was never about bloodlines or titles at all. It was about choosing, every single day, to remain honest, patient, and true to myself, regardless of how difficult that choice sometimes proved to be. You transformed an entire family, Alexander said quietly, an entire city's understanding of what worth truly means. We transformed it together, Alina corrected gently, as she always did. Your faith in me, even during the darkest moments, gave me the courage to keep proving myself long after I might have given up entirely on my own. They sat together quietly as evening settled fully over the manor's peaceful gardens, the same gardens where Alina had once stood alone, uncertain and afraid, wondering whether this new world would ever truly accept her. 5 years later, that uncertainty had long since faded, replaced by quiet confidence earned through patience, integrity, and an unshakable belief in her own worth, regardless of how the world around her once chose to judge it. Somewhere across the city, St. Agnes' home continued its important work, sheltering children who arrived with nothing but hope, much as Alina herself once had. And within those same walls, a new generation of children now grew up hearing her story, not as a distant legend, but as living proof that circumstances of birth need never determine the boundaries of what a person could ultimately achieve, provided they carried within themselves the same quiet, unbreakable strength that had carried Alina through every difficult chapter of her own remarkable journey. The Duke's family had mocked him once, for choosing an orphan bride they believed unworthy of joining their ranks. 5 years later, that same family stood united in their genuine love and admiration for the woman who had transformed not only their financial fortunes, but their entire understanding of what true nobility actually meant. Alina had entered their world as an outsider, dismissed and doubted at every turn. She left that difficult chapter behind entirely, becoming instead the very heart of the family that had once refused to see her worth, proving, beyond any doubt, that character forged through hardship would always outshine privilege inherited without effort, and that genuine love, patience, and integrity could overcome even the deepest prejudices, given enough time, enough courage, and enough unwavering faith in one's own quiet strength.